Thomas Jefferson was born on Chadwell Plantation in Goochland County, Virginia. He went to the College of William and Mary and graduated in 1762. He had no formal religion. His previous occupations were a lawyer and a planter. He encouraged agriculture, and he was not a blood-soaking radical. His political party was Democratic Republican. He created a legacy with the Jeffersonian Republicans. He got rid of Adams' midnight appointees. He said in law that a federal judge can be removed from office for high crimes and misdemeanors. He doubled the nation's size by the Louisiana Purchase. During his administration, there were navigating trade and investment disputes. During his time in office, he created the Virginia dynasty. There was a fight between old Republicans and national Republicans. The National Republicans warned against King Andrew. He said that the U.S. is the strongest government on earth.
Candidate. But then the Republican elector who was supposed to throw his vote away forgot to, so there ended up being a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. As per the Constitution, the election went to the House of Representatives, where it took 36 ballots and the intervention of Alexander Hamilton before Jefferson was finally named president. Incidentally, Burr and Hamilton really disliked each other, and not in like the passive-aggressive way that politicians dislike each other these days, but in the 4 years later they would have a duel and Burr killed Hamilton kind of way. A duel which occurred, wait for it, in New Jersey. But anyway, shortly after the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment was passed, making the Electoral College simpler, but not as simple as, say, one person's vote counting as one vote. Anyway, complain about the Electoral College all you want, but without it, we would never have had President Rutherford B. Hayes, and just look at that beard! So Jefferson became president, and his election showed that Americans wanted a more democratic politics, where common people were more free to express their opinions. The Federalists were never really a threat again in presidential politics, and arguably the best thing that John Adams ever did was transfer power in an orderly and honorable way to his rival Jefferson. Jefferson's campaign slogan was Jefferson and liberty, but the liberty in question was severely limited. Only a fraction of white men were allowed to vote, and of course there was no liberty for the slaves. There's a lot of contentious debate on the subject of Jefferson and slavery, but here's my 2 cents, which I should not be allowed to contribute because we should only round to the nearest nickel, which, by the way, features Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson was a racist, and he wrote about black people's inherent inferiority to whites and Native Americans, and the fact that he fathered children with one of his slaves doesn't change that. George Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Well, sort of. They were supposed to be freed upon his wife's death, but living in a house full of people who were waiting for you to die made Martha want to free them while she was still alive. But with few exceptions, Jefferson didn't free his slaves upon his death, and throughout his life, he used the sale of slaves to finance his lavish lifestyle. And this leads to 2 big philosophical questions when it comes to history. First, if Jefferson clearly did not think that black people were the intellectual or moral equals of whites and was perfectly comfortable keeping them in bondage, then what does the most important phrase of the Declaration of Independence actually mean? And the second question is even broader. Does it matter if a person of tremendous historical importance had terrible aspects to their character? Does being a bad person diminish your accomplishments? I don't have a great answer for those questions, but I will tell you that no one remembers Richard Nixon for starting the EPA. But this is very important to understand. Slaves were aware of the concept of liberty, and they wanted it. So in addition to an election, 1800 also saw one of the first large-scale slave uprisings. Gabriel's Rebellion was organized by a Richmond, Virginia blacksmith who hoped to seize the capital, kill some of its inhabitants, and hold the rest hostage until his demands for abolition were met. But the plot was discovered before they could carry it out, and Gabriel, along with 25 other slaves, was hanged. But after the rebellion, Virginians, if they didn't know it already, were very aware that slaves wanted and expected liberty. And the response was predictable. Virginia made its laws concerning slaves much harsher. It became illegal for slaves to meet in groups on Sundays unless supervised by whites, and it became much more difficult for whites to legally free their slaves. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. Identify the author, no shock. Fail to identify the author, shock. The love of freedom, sir, is an inborn sentiment which the God of nature has planted deep in the heart. Long may it be kept under the arbitrary institutions of society, but at the first favorable moment it springs forth and flourishes with a vigor that defies all check. This celestial spark, which fires the breast of the savage, which glows in that of the philosopher, is not extinguished in the bosom of the slave. It may be buried in the embers, but it still lives, and the breath of knowledge kindles it to flame. Thus we find, sir, there have never been slaves in any country who have not seized the first favorable opportunity to revolt. I mean, from the bit at the beginning about the love of freedom, it seems like it could be Jefferson, but the rest does not seem like Jefferson. Probably wasn't a slave, since they were denied access to education precisely because the breath of knowledge is so dangerous to the institution of slavery. Oh, this is looking pretty bleak for me, Stan. John Jay? Dang it! Who was it? George Tucker? Who the John C. Calhoun is George Tucker? Is there a person watching this who knew that it was George Tucker? Fine. Ah! Apparently, George Tucker was a member of the General Assembly of Virginia, and the mystery document was a description of Gabriel's rebellion that suggested a solution to the inherent problem of rebellious slaves. He argued that we should set up a colony for them in Indian Territory in Georgia, which of course also wouldn't have worked because we were soon to steal that territory. But back to Jefferson. His idea was to make the government smaller, lower taxes, shrink the military, and make it possible for America to become a bucolic, agrarian empire of liberty rather than an English-style industrial mercantile nightmare landscape. So how did he do? Well, really well at first. Jefferson got rid of all the taxes except for the tariff, especially the whiskey tax, and then when he woke up with a terrible cheap whiskey-induced hangover, he paid off part of the national debt, he shrunk the army and the navy, and basically made sure that America wouldn't become a centralized English-style state for at least the next 60 years. Low taxes and small government sounds great, but no navy? That would be tough, especially when we needed ships and marines to fight the Barbary pirates on the shores of Tripoli, who kept capturing our ships in the Mediterranean and enslaving their crews. This is yet another example of how foreign affairs keeps getting in the way of domestic priorities. In this case, the domestic priority of not wanting to spend money on a navy. Also, vitally, Jefferson's presidency really marks the last time in American history when a Republican president didn't want to spend money on the military. Don't get me wrong, Democrats can do it too. I'm looking at you, LBJ. As much as he wanted to get rid of any trace of the Federalists, Jefferson found himself thwarted by that eminently conservative and undemocratic institution, the Supreme Court. Jefferson appointed Republicans to most government positions, but he couldn't do anything about the Supreme Court because they serve for life. And since the country was only like 12 years old, they were all still pretty fresh. Most important among them was Chief Justice John Marshall, who happened to be a Federalist. Marshall was Chief Justice basically forever, and is without question the most important figure in the history of the Supreme Court. He wrote a number of key opinions, but none was more important than the 1803 decision in Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is so important because in that decision, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review.